Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today I'm going to touch on something that I've never come across before. I've never done this, so you might class it as less a how I paint things and how I'm going to paint things. The musketmen of the sort of 17th century, so anything from the English Civil War, the 30 Years' War and similar, all wore fairly similar clothing. Now I'll touch on that a little bit later. This fella here is geared towards being one of the members of the Catholic League during the 30 Years' War, so he might have served under General Tilly and, given the given the Protestants a jolly good thrashing until the arrival of Gustavus Adolphus. Oops. Now, all of the paints will be listed in the description below, along with a couple of sources on historical information. So I've thoroughly enjoyed doing this, and I hope you do too. Without any further mucking around, let's get started. Now, something that I want to touch on really quickly before we get to the painting is actually the assembly of these guys, because they do come on these little integrated bases on the plastic miniatures, which is quite handy because it gives you something to stick to a cork if you're painting them in batches. So the bases that actually come with this kit, and are fairly common across most of the sort of Pike and Shotte games that I've seen, feature normally 4 to 6 figures on a single square or rectangle base. So what you can do is just blue tack a fella to a cork, so you've got something to hold and paint and what have you, and then when you're finished, just pop them off, glue them to the base, and away you go. Makes it so you can reach everything you're painting. I love this guy's hat so much. But from a painting perspective, this will be much simpler. But because I like painting single figures, here we go. I've got him on a little round base, and he'll work quite well for games like the Pikeman's Lament. So on the subject of painting, I've started by priming this fella with a spray of Leather Brown from Vallejo. Now, their Leather Brown spray primer is based on the game color range rather than the model color range, because here is Vallejo Leather Brown model color, and you might see there is some discrepancy there between those two colors. This I really like because it is a nice, worn kind of leather, and it's going to be quite useful for some of the stuff that we're going to be painting on this particular fella. Now, whether you are painting for English Civil War or the 30 Years' War, honestly, there wasn't a huge amount of difference in clothing. The major difference between the two was in how much armor the horsemen were wearing. And honestly, some of the hats. I think this set doesn't have quite enough of the right hats for the 30 Years' War because I know what the locals were wearing. But that aside, it's perfect for either side. So I'm starting off here, I have Brown Rose, and this is quite a pink color. We're going to start by base coating his skin in this. Now the really nice thing about these is that they cover super well, so you'll probably find you can get away with doing one coat of this, but if the color's not solid, you can come back and give it a second. Now that really is more pink than a Muppet's nose, but when we shade it, that is going to tone down quite a bit. It'll look really cool. Now, the 17th century was really when the arrival of standardized and sort of state-standing armies arrived en masse in Europe. That existed before, of course, state forces going back as far as the Romans, for example. But this was really the period in which sort of levy armies or mercenaries swapped over to states having their own forces in a big way. So uniformity at this point was really up in the air. Now what I'm using here, this is Azure, and from what I've read, this was being quite common amongst the Catholic League troops under General Tilly, Bavarians finding a way to have a light blue on their uniforms, my great surprise of course. But there isn't really a correct answer to really any of this. The color of his jacket, of his trousers and what have you, it might some days have been simply what he'd stolen from the peasants in the village that the force was quartered in, so make it up as you like. But Azure, lovely blue color, and covers very well. So let's finish off his jacket here. Now the only part of this fella that I didn't want to get any blue on was his trousers, because I don't have the game color Leather Brown to touch that up. So fingers crossed with me, folks. I don't want to have to paint that if I can avoid it. I really like that primer color. We'll move on now. I have here some Ivory. And this is a brilliant color if you're going to paint white for this period. Wherever you can avoid it, I'd suggest don't use a pure white. to our eyes it will be almost indistinguishable at this sort of scale. But now anywhere that's going to be white, go ahead, knock yourself out. Now I've actually made a mistake there and noticed much too late that his cross belts weren't going to be white. These would have been sort of a kid skin leather or something along those lines. So I've done half of one white, which is a lovely base coat for Cork Brown. Now when it comes to his equipment, we're going to paint all of this in Cork Brown, including his satchel, but you'll see that we will paint that a separate color later. For now, we're just laying down some base coats. So these belts, both sides. Now that'll teach me to triple check what I'm doing. I'm going to move on now and I'm going to paint buff. Buff was a material as well. And we're going to paint in his satchel with this because this would have been fairly common. Now this is a really bright color and you'll see the value in going over this with a little bit of Cork Brown first as you apply it. Now you will find most likely you need to come back and give that a second coat for a nice solid color. It's going to be important we can avoid highlighting it if we're careful with our base coats. Now most of the documentation I found suggests that Imperial or Catholic League troops tended to have red stockings. Of course, again, we can go as nuts as we like with this, but I am going to use red. And I've got here Carmine Red. Let's apply this just carefully over his stockings. Now while those dry, we're going to go back up the model and we're going to paint in his hair. Now of course, there's no right color for hair. I just suggest when you do paint them, introduce a little bit of variety to your units. Don't paint them all in black. I've got here German Camo medium brown, which is just the first brown I picked when I reached out. And I'm painting this now because in a couple of seconds when I paint his hat, I can use that essentially as a tidy up stage for this. Now as well as his hair, I also painted his shoes in the same color. Any sort of leathery brown will do the job there, so I figured that's close enough, it'll work fine. In the same vein, I have here black grey, and I'm going to use this to paint in the wraps around his ankles, and I'm also going to use it to paint in his hat. You could use black, but I tend to like a black grey or something like German grey, which is off black, because it gives you a little that you can do with it once you shade it. Now by using a fairly narrow palette and painting, say, brown on the hair of one guy and then using that same brown on the stockings of another, and so on throughout a unit, you can use a very limited number of colors but still get some variation, so they look a little more ragtag than you might ordinarily get. Now speaking of painting black, I'm actually using proper black here because I do want his equipment to look fairly smart. So just a little bit of black on his scabbard here. And of course you could paint in his hat or similar using this too. Don't feel like you only need this for his scabbard. Now I've also touched in the grip and the hilt of his sword in black as well. It's not strictly necessary, but I do tend to find that a metallic will go over black a little bit more smoothly. It looks nicer. I've got here flat brown, and we are going to use this for any wooden details. So the musket, funnily enough. And I'd suggest when it comes to the barrel itself, goodness, I can't keep them in shot today. Just paint the whole thing in brown, and we will touch up the metallic stuff later. Now with the wooden bits detailed, it's time to pop on the metal. And for this, I've actually switched to a CITADEL color. This is Iron Hand Steel. You could use oily steel from Vallejo, but I tend to find the coverage on these CITADEL base ones just a little better on the metallics. So that's why I'm using this. So let's just pop in all of the metal details. I'm not too worried if I do hit the match itself. And you can paint in the grip and basket on his, sword at the same time here. Now once that metal is dried, it's time to go back and just touch up any of your base colors which you might have hit with another. Do a little bit of tidy just to make sure that everything is nice and solid before we shade it. Now you can use one of Vallejo's brown shades, but I'm actually going to switch to the Army Painter here. And I've got my little bottle of Strong Tone and Quickshade Mixing Medium. Half and half, it works brilliantly for this sort of thing. I'm just going to pop a little bit out onto my palette. And then we'll begin applying this to the miniature. And we want to douse everything in this. And you'll see straight away what that starts doing, which is wonderful. It's going to give us lots of shading without really affecting our color too much. Now, any areas where you end up with too much of it on flat areas, big klodgy bits, you can just move it around with your brush while it's still wet. So once we've got this whole thing covered, I'm going to leave them somewhere to dry for about 30 to 40 minutes. And goodness me, I cannot keep them in shot. Now once that sheet is dried, we have, well, pretty much a finished miniature. And honestly, if you've got 20 guys in a regiment and 6 regiments on the table at a time, why not just base them up and call that finished? But we can take it a little further. Now, I'm not going to bother highlighting his trousers, not just because I don't really have the right leather color to do it, but because across that number of miniatures, you're never going to see it. So concentrate on things that are going to bring him to life a little. So I'm going to paint up his skin a little further, and also his jacket, and 1 or 2 other minor details. So another great reason for having Ivory in your collection is that you've got an almost universal highlight color. So let's have a look at my palette here. And here I've got Azure and just a little bit of Ivory. And I'm going to mix in just a tiny bit, you know what, I'm going to just mix it together and see what happens. Roughly half and half makes for a pretty sharp highlight. 1 part Ivory to 3 parts of your base color is normally what I'd aim for. But when you're coming to miniatures that you want to see the highlights on at gaming distance, I would suggest brighter is probably better. So let's bring them up here, and with just a little bit of this on my brush, I'm going to highlight some of the edges of his jacket. I might have a little bit much there, but if I need to, I can go back to my Azure, just neat. And as well, you'll find that these paints, they do darken a little as they dry. So just pick out any areas you want to highlight. And again, purely optional this stage. Now, another trick you can use if you're painting large regiments is just to highlight your front rank. So this fella standing at the front with his musket at the ready, the guy standing behind him, you might skip the highlights. Easy as. I've got here Cork Brown with about the same mix of, Ivory in here. And I'm just going to pick a few areas where I want his belts to have a little bit of highlighting. This is a wee bit of a funny angle. It will even work for buff. Basically, any natural fabric or material that you want to highlight, as long as you've got Ivory, you will never be short a highlight color. Get into the habit of mixing, and you will find you've always got something you can use there. Now, rather than mixing this color, I'm going to use Tan Earth and paint over these little, I guess it'd be cartridges, wouldn't they? Something similar. I do not know the name for them, but these little dealy boppers that he's got his gunpowder in. I'm sure someone will correct me, but I quite like the term dealy bopper actually. Now what I've got is some Beige Red, and we're going to use this to tidy up his skin, because it's still a little bit pink. So let's go ahead, get some of this on my brush, and I am going to aim to paint most of his skin in this color, but leave that brown rose shaded in the recesses. Now, this can take a little bit of practice. If you are worried about it, just concentrate on cheekbones and his nose and the backs of his hands. Those are relatively easy to reach. And finally, if you're an odd one like me who actually quite enjoys painting faces, I have here a little Vallejo basic skin tone. Now this is honestly one of the worst basic skin tones I've ever seen. If you see somebody who is this color, you call an ambulance. But we're going to add just a tiny touch of this to the tip of his nose. I might actually have a little bit much on my brush there. And just in the corners of his cheeks to really accentuate some of these facial features. Now you can also touch in the back of his knuckles with a little bit of that. Like I said, some folks don't like painting faces. I really do, and I think for your front rank troops, if you're going to go for that route, it's worth that little bit of extra effort. I've got some black grey with my Ivory mix again, because I forgot to highlight his hat. I actually completely forgot he had a hat band, but we're not going to talk about that. So I'm going to use the edge of my brush here, just to lightly flick along with my highlight mix here. And then finally, to highlight the ivory that we used earlier for the white, I have here a little bit of off-white. And this is ever so slightly not a pure white, which is going to make it ideal for our cuffs and lace. Now, once I've done this, what I'm going to do is take them outside, hit them with a matte varnish. We'll dull down some of the shine that the shade has left behind. And we'll pop a base on him, see what he looks like when he's all finished. And there at last, our musketman is complete, and I've actually really enjoyed doing this. The research into the uniforms was a topic that I've not really covered before, so if, by some chance you've got better sources than I do, or I have still missed some historical detail, feel free, please do drop it in the comments, especially if you've got links to some sources. Now, I will drop a couple of sources that I've used and found really interesting into the description, so if you are coming to the 30 Years' War or the English Civil War for the first time, you find this sort of stuff interesting, then hopefully that'll be useful to you there too. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for all the light and sound equipment, as well as the patrons who keep me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support is invaluable. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Facebook are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.